The first time I read through our text this morning, the word that popped out at me from the page is the word suffering. It occurs 4 times in this short passage alone, and verse for verse, the word suffering occurs more in 1 Peter than it does in any other document in the Gospels and letters. Now why? Why this interest in suffering? Of course, there are many different kinds of suffering. There is the suffering from illness, from natural disaster, from divorce, from addiction, from losing a loved one. But 1 Peter has in mind a very particular kind of suffering. The author, whom we call Peter, though it may well be someone after Peter's time, writing in his name, calls attention to a particular kind of suffering, not from natural disaster, not from losing a loved one, but in the language of the text, the kind of suffering that comes when you do good and others push back, when you do what is right and others react with hostility. I do good, attempting to do God's will, and someone else says, "Oh, no." And as a result of the suffering that was taking place in Peter's congregation, some people were disappearing. You know how it is. Sometimes it's quite dramatic. They suffer something in a board meeting, slap their hands down on the table, get up, walk out, and as they get to the door, turn back and say, "And I'm taking my money with me." Sometimes the pain is quieter, but the result no less the same. They disappear, not in church 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You see them in the aisle, at the grocery store, late at night. "Where have you been?" "Well, I just couldn't bear it anymore." Now, what kind of suffering is this? What kind of suffering is this, and how does Peter respond to it? Well, this is where a little background on the text gets us to a better place of vision. You see, Peter wrote to a congregation of Gentiles who had converted from their Gentile religions to the God of Israel through Jesus Christ. And I would just remind you in a friendly way that a Gentile is anyone who is not Jewish. You wake up in the morning, you look in your mirror, and what you see is a Gentile. Now here's the thing. In those days, Gentiles liked to keep things the same. They liked their idols, their big, dressy, flashy idols, like Zeus, Aphrodite, and Artemis. They liked their traditions, their trade unions, and their clubs. They thought of power as rolling up your muscle and making a big public demonstration of it that would bring other people down to their knees. And strange as it may sound, the Roman social system was a pyramid with 1.5% of the people at the top, and going down the pyramid, people were locked into places where they had less and less power, social movement, and fewer resources. And you know how it is, at least it is with me, even when I'm in a place that's uncomfortable, if I learn how to live in it, then I am more comfortable continuing in the discomfort than I am in contemplating a change. If it's hard now, think of how much it could be harder if there is a change. Sometimes I even speak with disdain about people who contemplate change. Sometimes I resent the way they disturb my world. Sometimes I just wish they would go away. And that is how the garden variety Gentiles, the one who had not converted to the God of Israel, the ones who were still loyal to Zeus, Aphrodite, and Artemis, felt about those who had drifted away from their Gentile orientation and had come to the God of the Jews. And not only had they left the Gentile gods and gone to the God of the Jews, but they had done so through the crucified Jew, Jesus Christ. The opposite of rolling up your muscle and flexing your power. I can hear them. Can't you? I can hear these Gentiles who didn't convert saying to one another, how could they do such a thing? How could they give up all of this? And there was one more thing that caused suffering in the congregation to whom Peter wrote. At one time, we thought that the Romans engaged in formal persecution at this time. Throw them to the lions, burn them at the stake. But there is very little evidence that this kind of persecution was occurring at the time 1 Peter wrote. Here is where the suffering came from. The old line Gentiles ostracized people whom they had known for years, people for whom families had been in relationship with generation. Family members ostracized family members. They broke up groups, friendships, and families. Now, if you're like me, when you first hear this, you think, well, that's a price, but it's not so bad. You can get over losing a friendship or two. Oh, but in those days, identity was much more communal than it is now. You were not just an individual making it on your own. Wherever you were, your community was there in you. And wherever the other members of your community were, there you were also. But when you were ostracized, when you are cut off, your community says to you, you no longer count. You no longer belong. It is almost as if they say, you no longer are. You get up in the morning, you look in the mirror, and you do not recognize whom you see. That happens to me. I do something contrary to who I am, and I look in the mirror in the morning, and for a moment I think, that's not Ron Allen. Does this happen to you? Think about it happening not just for a moment, but in terms of all your life, identity, and relationships. Well, our text this morning is filled with fascinating and sometimes perplexing detail, but if we step back, we can see that it all functions around one great purpose. Peter yearns for the Gentiles who have converted, the believers. He yearns for them to continue. He says, even if you suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Even if you suffer for standing up and doing good, even if you suffer for stand up and doing what is right, you are blessed. And to be blessed here means to have the sense that you are deeply aligned with God's purposes, even when those purposes run counter to the purposes of others in your culture. And elsewhere, Peter assures the congregation that they have a new identity, that they are a new community, Once you were no people, but now you are God's people, a holy nation. Peter points them to Christ, who suffered and was faithful in suffering, and whom God made alive. Well, every time I preach, every single time, I ask myself the question, can I believe it? Can I really believe this? And I am here this morning to say, I can believe this. I believe 1 Peter is spot on by thinking of the world of two great networks of values and behaviors. There is the network of Zeus, Artemis, and Aphrodite. It is a network of Gentile things. And while we do not erect these statues in our parks, you won't find Zeus across from the local swimming pool, we do have things that function as gods, as ultimates, that give us our values and practices. Things like money, position, political party, race, ethnicity, nationalism, even things like houses and cars. And worshiping these Gentile things creates Gentile qualities in our culture. Elsewhere, 1 Peter uses words to describe the characteristics of this Gentile culture, and among them are malice, insincerity, slander, passions, revelry, cautions, carousing, dissipation, blasphemy, words that characterize the news feed that came up on my computer when I logged in this morning to catch up on what had happened overnight. But here's the other thing. God offers this world the opportunity to become another world through Jesus Christ. It is a world of, quote, genuine mutual love from the heart. It is a world of mercy. It is a world of compassion. It is a world in which people are good stewards of God's manifold grace, by serving one another. And at the end, there is a hope that is pure, undefiled, and unfading. And so the question is, how do we get from one world to the other? How do we get from living in Gentile ways to living in the ways of God? How do we go from the world of malice and slander to the world of doing right and what is good? And the answer is God has given us a choice. And the choice is, what kind of world do you want? What kind of life do you want? You and I are often in situations similar to the congregation to which 1 Peter wrote. We have to make choices. We have to make choices about whether and when we do what is right. Choices about whether we are willing to take the risk to face the possibility of suffering or not. When some friends in your company are spouting Gentile things, say malice, are you willing to speak up or not? When something happens in our culture that reinforces Gentile qualities, are we willing to go to the street and say no or not? When the congregation considers a proposal that moves in directions contrary to God's purposes, are we willing to stand up and say something or not? For 20 years, my family and I worshiped in a congregation in Indianapolis. We sat right over there, and we sat right behind a couple named Joe and Wynn Smith. I can see her about this hall, white hair, bobbing with the rhythms of the hymns. I can see him, tall, dignified Southern gentleman, as we say in this text, gentle and reverent. In 1941, they were missionaries of ours to the Philippines when the Japanese conquered that country and took all the expatriates and interned them in camps. For 3.5 years, Wynn and Joe lived in a series of camps under very difficult conditions. Limited food, sleeping on bare floors, almost no medical care for their infant son, divided into men and women, separated by barbed wire, where Wynn and Joe could meet one another for just a few minutes each day, constantly watched, sometimes beaten. You would think that these conditions defined about as much suffering as one could have. But this couple had been charter members of the Disciples' Peace Fellowship, which organized just a few years before. And Disciples' Peace Fellowship is predicated upon the idea that every person is a child made in the image of God. And so in the camp, Joe and Wynn took to attempting to treat the guards as if they bore the image of God, seeking a common spark of humanity, seeking some connection, even bowing in that Japanese way to the guards as they came and went. But soon, some of the other internees objected. How could you? How can you bow to these people? Already an intense situation, already day-to-day suffering, but then to be pushed to the edge of your own community, suffering for doing right. One of our daughters, age 16, interviewed Joe and Wynn for a paper that our daughter had to write for school. And when she came to this point in the narrative, she asked them, "How could you do that? Why did you continue to bow when they treated you that way?" And their answer haunts me yet. I'm paraphrasing now. The church baptized us to do what is right. We believed that the guards were made in the image of God, and that our baptism had commissioned us to treat them as if they were made in that image. And we made this choice. We could take the risk of the moment, or we could live with the lifelong ache of knowing that we had violated the baptismal commission God had given us in the water through Jesus Christ. I have never been in a situation as fraught as the situation of Joe and Wynne. But if something happens, I have a choice. I can remain Gentile, and I know what will happen. The Gentile qualities of the world and the Gentile qualities of my life will only increase. But if I make the other choice, if I stand up for doing good, who knows what will happen? In the Who Knows What Will Happen department, the internees gathered for a reunion some years after the war, and they invited the commandant of the camp to come. Can you imagine it? Breaking bread with the man who kept the lock closed on the door. And after the reunion, Joe published a memoir, Mimeographed Sheets. And the cover of the memoir shows the commandant and Joe sitting in that kneeling Japanese position, face to face, talking. I was not in the room, the hospital room, when Joe died. But I can imagine it. The fluorescent lights, the pad of the nurse's shoes on the floor, the beep, beep, beep of the monitor. And I can imagine that as he slipped out of this world and toward the next, he went with a conscience that was clear for having done what is right. I think about myself. I think about you in that bed. Beep, beep, beep. As you slip from this world to the next, how would you like your conscience to be?